I never get that right. I don't know which side. And we are live whenever you are, wherever you are. Thank you for joining the Design of Everyday People, where I talk to senior designers from all over the world and where you literally get to ask them anything. So if you have any questions as the conversation goes, please leave those in the comments below, whether you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn. I think there's a live chat function, so feel free to throw your questions at us. But let's make this as interactive as possible and leave where you're actually listening in from and where you're tuning from. What time in the world are you sort of dialing in? And without further ado, let's start the first live stream of 2026. This is the Design of Everyday People. Okay, well, that took very long to load. So I don't know if there was lag on your end, but there was definitely lag on my end. But let's kick off with the sponsored of this episode. Today's event, I partnered with Shift UX. Again, there's some lag, and they've just launched their comprehensive The State of AI Design 2026. You can see that report scrolling on the left here. And it's where Rajiv, the founder, audited over 5,000 senior product design roles in Q4. And he found something shocking. The market was in split. Generalist design roles focused on UI execution, they actually flatline in terms of salary. While architect roles, folks that are focusing on like system logic risk, has jumped by 28% year on year. So this brings me to a lot of questions that I have in my head, which is like, what does that mean for generalist designers? Like, I consider myself one. Like, what's happening to our roles? Where does our salary stand today? And are we fundamentally a liability because AI brings down the cost of execution? And if we're generalists, we like to execute a lot. What are the skills today that are needed and the job market demands and that the employer values so we can stay competitive as generalists? And Rajiv found a bunch more interesting data points and insights during this rigorous reporting. And he will be hosting a live briefing to go through all of it, right? This Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, or Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. There's another slot Tuesday as well, just depending on what you guys want. So in this live briefing, he'll walk you through the full salary data and break down the 12-week roadmap to pivot from a generalist, what we speak about earlier, to an architect. 28% year over year raise in terms of salary, and help you reposition yourself for that higher salary potentially. So you can get access to the live briefing and report by scanning this QR code that I have in the top left, but I'll also quickly flash that here for you guys. If you're interested in downloading the report and joining the live briefing, you can scan that or head to the link somewhere in the description of the event and access both for free using my code Chris100. And after going through that report, if you're still confused, and I highly recommend you attend his live briefing. If you're not sure what to do or have any questions, both of those are free, the report and the briefing, if you use this code Chris100. So without further ado, let's actually get started. Again, I'll leave that QR code in the top corner, like this one here, if you want to get that report. All right, just don't forget that code, because obviously, I'm here to help you, so you might as well not pay for it. Okay, so welcome to How to Make Better Design Decisions. And with always, I start with introductions. I'm Chris, the founder of UX Playbook, but before that, a self-taught designer struggling to get into UX. And now I spend most of my time helping designers navigate a fuzzy UX career, from building your first portfolio to leading your first design team. But that's actually enough about me. Today, I'm joined by a guest, Linn Vizard. Hopefully I got the surname correct, a designer, educator, and founder of Made Manifest, a boutique service design consultancy. So let's get her out and find out how she's doing. Hey, Lynn, how you doing?
Hey, Chris, I'm doing great.
Awesome. Did I get that surname correct? Because I'm very bad
You,
at pronouncing surnames.
you nailed it. It was
Okay.
perfect. I've
Okay.
I've been called all sorts of things, lizard, wizard. It's all good, but you nailed it.
Okay. Wizard is not a bad surname to have in
Right?
general. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially if you're a fan of Stranger Things and therefore D&D. But for the folks that don't know you, Lynn, you run a boutique service design agency, but can you, tell the folks more about you and kind of like maybe from some career stuff, some highlights, and just where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an industrial designer by training, although I never really practiced industrial design. And when I came out into the job market, 2008 recession, it was pretty rough. But I ended up sort of working in UX and digital. And what I found I really loved was the strategy and research side of things. And over time, transitioned my career to really focus on service design. So very strategic, complex, multi-stakeholder, a lot of organizational design stuff, and that's what I really love to do. So this year is actually 5 years that Made Manifest has been an incorporated business, which I'm really excited about. We're based in Toronto, Canada, and we have an amazing team. And we get to do really, really cool projects and help organizations make better decisions about the services that they're delivering.
Awesome. Sorry, that was another lag from this internet. Congratulations, 5 year in business. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
How is the team? Are you plans for growth, or you want to keep it a small boutique and pick the projects you want to work on?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a sweet spot for scale. I mean, obviously, it's amazing to work with lots of collaborators and the kind of scale and size and impact of the projects. Last year, we actually had some of our largest projects. We're doing a multi-ministry project with one of the governments here around regulatory compliance. So like really complex, one of the largest projects we've done. But that said, I also don't want to be huge because I love really knowing the team intimately. I think what's really important to me is great client relationships. So yeah, trying to kind of find that sweet spot for scale where we get to do cool stuff with cool people. We've had a lot of fun. We're currently working on a pilot project looking at putting point of care testing in long-term care homes and trying to measure the qualitative and quantitative impact of that. We've done retail strategy for direct-to-consumer e-commerce jewelry brand and getting to be in their retail stores and look at their operations and systems. So, yeah, as I said, kind of trying to find that sweet spot for scale and feeling pretty good about where things are at.
Amazing. Okay, so let me kick off this conversation and kind of help us frame it. So every design decision we typically make does two things in two camps, right? Holding your work back or moving it forward. Which one is that? And sometimes we don't really realize which one is which. It's a bit fuzzy, and we might be making calls based on what worked last time, what feels safe, what stakeholders want to hear, or worse, just like pure gut instinct. Although sometimes it works, but not all the time. And potentially that's why there's sort of like endless feedback cycles, and that becomes the norm. And that's kind of why I wanted to bring Lynn on here to help us break this down. Three things we want to chat about. The key things to consider when making design decisions. And this is from a really interesting lens from you, Lynn, because you're running a service design consultancy. So a lot of the problems are inherently, a lot more different than potentially digital stuff, but there's so much overlap as well. And then the second thing is, just common mistakes to avoid when sort of communicating these decisions or making these decisions. And then finally, you're going to share a bit of your framework for making better calls, right? Better decisions. So that would be fun. And you have a fan here, it looks like.
Oh, hey, Lita. Nice to see you. Oh, that's so lovely.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool that supporters turn up. I also want
Yeah.
to remind the audience that as you listen, you can go ahead and drop the questions below. And these things are recorded because everybody always asks me, so I have to say it. Just search Chris from UX Playbook on YouTube to find it, and you'll get all the good stuff. Okay, we have another fan of this session. Love it. Okay, nice. Okay, let's get it started. Where do we start here? Well, let's level set and talk a bit about service design, and like give me I guess, what is service design for the digital product designers out there that might not have been used to this world?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of like to think of service design as you're sort of zooming out beyond the digital touch point or the app or the website, and then you're looking at all of the different channels and pieces that go into a service experience. So sometimes, as a just really concrete example, I like to talk about, when I was working in UX, I did a project to redesign the online account for Toronto Public Library, one of my favorite projects I've ever worked on. And it was really about information architecture, the interaction design, the interface, the UX, shipping that, building it. And actually that is still in use today, which is one of my favorite things because I use it all the time. Looking at more of a service design type project, we did a project to redesign an application process for a nonprofit that was delivering grant funding. And so this is pretty unusual, but in this project, there were actually no digital touch points. We were looking at the application form, the process that the staff was going through, the process that someone applying for grant funding was going through, the payment system and how they were making payments. And we're really trying to zoom out, map that all out, look at the process, figure out where we could optimize, and then kind of prototype and test different interventions. So I kind of like to share those as two sort of contrasting pieces. They have lots in common, right? You're going to do that deep understanding of your user and user needs. You're going to map and sketch things out, figure out where you want to make changes, prototype and test, and then eventually ship your interventions. But what I will say with service design, and sort of why I love this decision-making topic so much, is because of the sort of more holistic or kind of complex nature. Inevitably, you're then running into a lot of these different complex organizational and stakeholder pieces, and you're typically engaging the org side almost as much as you are the kind of end user side.
Right. Exactly. And yeah, so many types of stakeholders that are involved in something you design, right? Whether
Exactly.
it's the end user or the 4 layers of people that needs to interact with the system or do something to deliver that service.
Exactly. And I kind of like to think about, design. There's this idea of design as a form of deliberate decision making, right? It's the craft of making decisions. And whether that's at a sort of very focused touch point or micro level of, a button location or a sort of micro interaction or interface decision, you're making decisions at that level. How should a specific touch point or experience be? And then you're making these really complex decisions, even potentially at, say, a policy level. So one of the things we ran into on the Toronto Public Library project was the word for fines accruing was a very complicated word, especially, for anyone actually, but especially for folks. Toronto's like super diverse and has people from all over the world. So it maybe if English isn't your first language, that's a really confusing word. And so in order to make that interface really successful, we actually went and asked to have a policy change on sort of how that was being communicated to make it clearer and easier for people. And we spent a lot of time testing the exact language that would make the most sense. So it was a bit of a mouthful, but I think in the end we landed on something like, fines that are due upon return or renewal of an overdue book. So it's a mouthful, but it's a lot clearer, right?
Yeah.
So just trying to illustrate, it's decisions all the way down, right? Whether it's what goes on the roadmap, how this interface should look, what concept are we testing, what do we want to go ask for money for, what trade-offs are we accepting or rejecting. All of that is really tied up, regardless of whether you're doing more sort of true UX interface design or you're doing these more complex sort of system service type projects.
Right. I really like what you said. And someone on the chat, please clip it, where design is deliberate decision making, and the alliteration is great, and that's simple enough for most folks to understand. So like that is Yeah, I want to clip that. I want to clip that. Okay, so let's talk more about this sort of decision-making piece where we're thinking about like, okay, like, you know, we're deep in a problem and we're working on it, and there's a couple of paths that kind of um we can navigate, and we're like, okay, well, should we go with A or B? Like, help me kind of clarify what are the things that you consider when you
Yeah.
sort of make these key design decisions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the challenges of our profession and one of the things we run into is that we're having to make a lot of these decisions collaboratively and often with people who are not designers, right? So whether that's your product manager, engineers and devs, executives, broader stakeholders, and everyone is sort of optimizing for something slightly different. And then as designers, we often have really strong instincts and opinions. I love, I don't know if this will date me, but in Clueless, I think there's a point where Cher talks about how Christian always wants everything to be beautiful and perfect, right? And
Yeah.
that's us, right? We can be perfectionists, we have a strong sense of aesthetic or craft or a strong vision, but we're not always the people. In fact, rarely are we the people who have final decision rights at every layer of those decisions. But to your point, Chris, in order to move the work forward, in order to not just completely stall out, we have to get to some sort of decisions, right? And so I think there's a few things we can consider and think about when you're faced with any decision. And the first is kind of the type of decision, right? Is this reversible or irreversible? Is it high stakes or low stakes? And part of what I see, maybe due to some of our designer personality traits, is we tend to treat every decision as like really high stakes and really irreversible, which causes a lot of this kind of paralysis and burnout because you're just like, everything feels so critical. So I think taking that step back and saying, what type of decision is this? What are the stakes and how permanent is it? Can really, really help you. And then the second thing I would say is, I think you touched on this in the beginning, clarifying some of that fuzziness around what actually is the decision-making model here. Like, is this a decision where I, as the designer, do have full authority to say we're doing A, not B, because XYZ, right?
Right.
Or is this a decision-making model where, actually your boss is going to decide, right? Autocratic. Doesn't matter, but ultimately in the hierarchy, it's the PM, perhaps, right? And so on and so forth. And, there's some great resources out there which we can link to and around like looking at different decision-making models and just understanding how is this decision going to get made? Who actually is in charge of this? I find that's actually where we get really stuck, is we're not sure who's in charge. And then finally, and I think we can dive into this a bit more later, but thinking about the context around the decision. Like, what are those different organizational incentives? What are the power dynamics? What are the constraints at play? Is there budget, timeline, risk issues that we need to be mindful of? And if you ignore the factors that I just mentioned, you kind of end up in a spot where there's good ideas that don't end up shipping, right? And so really just taking a step back and asking yourself, what type of decision is this? What's the decision-making model at play, and what's some of the context can help you clarify whether it's something you can just make a quick move on, or you're going to need to slow down and take that step back.
Yeah, sure. I really like that sort of simplifies and breaks down how to sort of make a decision more systematically, or at least thoughtfully, because you're considering all the things within your control. I want to dive more into sort of decision making models, and are you referring to sort of like stakeholder mapping, where you understand who actually has the power, or is it something different where it's like, how do I decide, or like which framework do I use to actually make that decision?
Yeah, so I would say it's kind of more the latter, right? And this is sort of where I got really interested in this and thinking like, how do decisions actually get made, and what are the different ways this happen? Because I think sometimes we don't it's something that would really serve us well to learn more about, or we make assumptions, or it's not necessarily clear how decisions are made. I think something that used to really frustrate me early in my career was, you would go into these meetings and think, okay, we're going to come out of this meeting with a decision. And I don't know if you can relate, but like you never do. Like you walk out and you're like, oh, it's clear as mud. I have no clue what we landed on. And I think something that really helped me was recognizing that actually decision making isn't a sort of moment in time. It's often a process, particularly in a team or an organization or a kind of more complex context. And so decision-making models are like really, really interesting, right? So you have this idea of autocratic, which is just like there is an ultimate decider king who holds the power, who makes the decision, right? And each of these decision models, I'll kind of share a couple and then I'll share a resource that's really cool. It's not that any one is good or bad, but it's that they have certain strengths and weaknesses. There's also kind of the avoidant decision making. Let's wait and see. We're sort of not going to actually make a decision. We're going to just kind of kick the can down the road and see what happens. Right? I think probably familiar also to folks. One of the actual kind of mistakes that tank your credibility that I wanted to kind of highlight was certainly in my world where we're often very kind of facilitative, participatory, working with these complex stakeholder groups, I think a lot of designers assume that we have to get to consensus. So consensus is this idea that we're going to get to a decision or a solution that everyone agrees with. And that can result in the dreaded design by committee. It can be very slow. It can be very frustrating. And actually, a lot of the time, it's not like really necessary. Or you think or sort of have an expectation that you need to get to consensus. But actually, in the end, XYZ exec is going to come in and say, this is what we're doing. Or the PM is going to say, lovely design idea, lovely feature idea, but we actually don't have budget and it's not the priority on the roadmap, so I don't care. I'll pause there, Chris, because I talk a lot, but does that kind of give you a feel for this idea of like, there's these different decision-making frameworks, and so thinking a little bit about what one is at play can help us?
Yeah. I mean, when you mention sort of participatory and facilitative, based on the work you do, it kind of triggered, for folks out there that might be familiar with like the design sprint, when there is a dedicated decision maker, right?
Yes.
Someone to give the final call. So again, it's not this sort of design by committee, but it's like, hey, we've mapped everything out. I'm making the call. We can disagree, but we actually have to commit, right? That idea of like, hey, it's not, nobody can be 100% happy at this, but there is someone that's like, I need to push the ball forward, and I'm the one that is ready for that trade-off, whatever that decision is.
Yeah.
So I think that's really helpful, where if you could make a decision in the room, assign a decision maker if it's highly critical. And then
I love that example for a few reasons. So the power of that, and what's really smart about the design sprint, is you have clarified the decision-making model and set the expectation ahead of time. This is the person who has decision rights. The other reason it's really important in a sprint is because you're prioritizing speed. And that is sort of in a way an autocratic, or you could say consultative, right? People are going to give their input. They're going to dot vote. They're going to argue for their sort of their position or their design or their feature, but ultimately, Chris decides, right? And so those models are good for speed. And in a design sprint, you're optimizing for speed, right? We have a week, we're going to get this thing done. So I think that's such a great and crystallized example, Chris, of like how the design sprint framework has designed around some of these constraints and challenges in order to deliver a result in a kind of that sprint chunk.
Yeah. So I guess the other logical question is, if we're not designing for speed, like if we're not optimizing for speed of decision, what else should we be optimizing for? Maybe it's like, okay, how does, if I say quality is my number one sort of thing I want to optimize for, do you have a decision-making model like that you would use if a client says, hey, we're really optimizing for quality of result, for example?
Yeah, such a good question, and might have to think a bit about it. I do think sort of this is where perhaps that consultative decision making can be great. So that's the idea of like, I decide with input. And so, we're going to get input from the people who are subject matter experts, perhaps from the user lens, perhaps from the, what are the organization's KPIs or kind of needs. And then someone is going to hold that decision-making power, someone who's hopefully sort of qualified and can optimize for the right things. Again, maybe that sits with your product or service owner, or maybe that sits with a design team. And they're going to take that input and then they're going to say, if we're optimizing for this is, what we think is the best decision. And then I think you get into these really interesting conversations about, well, how do you measure quality? How are you going to know that you've achieved quality? How do you define that? And how do you go back and say, yes, our decision led to the outcome we wanted? And then decision making sort of is that iterative loop where, okay, how do we look at the decision we made before, assess if it met the outcome we wanted, how are we going to tweak or adapt, whether it's our decision-making process, whether it's our set of inputs next time to further optimize for that outcome.
Yeah, because this conversation reminds me when I spoke to Bob Baxley, and he was, at Apple in the early days, and one of his metrics that he likes to sort of judge a designer's work and sort of make decisions on is, are you proud of the work? Are we proud of the work? And I was like, how do we measure that? Like, how do we find consensus of like, is this work good? Because traditionally how Apple operates is like, they are slower to market than everybody else, right? When they come out with something, they've sort of gone back and forth so many times that they've kind of ironed out all the kinks, as but yeah, that's really hard to sort of grasp on like what an organization cares about and their sort of own metrics, or even projects, like their own metrics of what success is and how decisions made within that. So like, then what you said around context really, really matters, because if you don't understand that and you're always optimizing for speed, then you're just kind of pushing people on the edge, and it's going to be really hard for you to sort of get decisions to your favor, or at least move at the pace you want to move, right?
Yeah, and I think this is also one of the fundamental tensions in our profession, is some of the things that are really important and we really care about are hard to fit into standard metrics, or some of the kind of things that can be counted, things that are more quantitative. So there is this really interesting sort of thing around how do you because it's in some ways quality is subjective, right? In some ways craft, aesthetic, taste, experience, like they're subjective, they're human, and that's part of the beauty. I was at Design Leadership Summit here in Toronto. Shout out to Preet, who does an amazing job organizing, and his team. And Matt Raw from New York Times did an amazing talk about how they defined these kind of quality principles at the New York Times. And it's exactly this conversation. Like, what's the bar? How do we know we've met it? What's important to us? But again, then you have to sort of say, how do we both qualitatively and quantitatively know we're meeting that bar? And it's tricky, right? It's subjective. And often organizations are optimizing for, profit, speed to market, some of these other things. So yeah, it's an interesting tension to navigate.
Yeah, and also like designers out there, feel free to push back on like that thing. What are we measuring this project by? Because sometimes it's not even potentially, like if you're a junior, like you don't even know why you're doing what you're doing and what metric it moves, or what the PM cares about, what the CEO cares about. So it's okay to be like, well, I kind of need to have a North Star in order to like work on this problem and make micro decisions within that for me to align with what you guys want. Otherwise, again, you can show something that's completely, off the rails, and they're just like, no budget, we're optimizing for speed. It's like, oh, I wish I would have known that 2 weeks ago, or at the start of the sprint, or whatever it is, right?
Yes, I think it's such a good point. And that's another one of those, I think, mistakes that tank your credibility. in terms of, as designers, I think especially, as we're, at all stages in our career, but perhaps as it's sort of earlier on and you've had less exposure and you're just trying to figure it all out, right? And no one gives you that roadmap or clarity or North Star, and you're just like, I don't know, what are we doing? Okay. But I think the mistake is underestimating the environmental, organizational, and cultural factors that are at play in a decision. So you as a designer think, I'm optimizing for the best experience, or, I really care about usability or accessibility, and we should. But actually it turns out the organization cares about being first to market and shipping, even over sometimes, let's say, quality. So I always like to use the example of, something I've seen is kind of as a useful analogy is promotions. I think often how we think promotions work is, work for a certain length of time, do a good job, get promoted, right? Like simple.
Yep.
And actually how it really works is there's timing factors, there's budget factors, macro and microeconomic factors. There's headcount. Is there an open role? Do you have someone who's really advocating for you? Is your manager going in at the leveling discussions and fighting for, no, I think this person's ready to level up? There's a lot more kind of complex environmental, organizational factors at play in the decision than just like, Lynn's been here for X number of years and does good work, right? Like, and I'm not saying it's right or fair, but I'm saying sort of switching on to those clues about those broader contextual factors at play in a decision can really help. And if you want to get like really nerdy, for public companies, listen to the quarterly earnings call.
Yeah.
What projects are they calling out? What are they saying the priorities are? How is the financial performance looking? What is the messaging to shareholders that is coming from the top? And that will start to give you contextual clues about that environmental kind of piece that you're swimming in and how decisions are being made, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, for public companies, that's awesome because all the data is like available. You can kind of like dive in. What would you do if you worked at like, I don't know, like an enterprise, but it's not public, like still a private company? Like
Yeah.
how would you sort of understand the broader narrative and context? Let's just say it's your
Yeah.
first month and you're like, what do I do?
I would start looking for clues about how decisions are being made. What do you notice, right? Is this a very consensus heavy culture where everyone's trying to agree and no one wants to sort of stand out? Is this a very top down culture where there's, I think a classic thing I always think about is like steering committee.
Yeah.
It has to go to steering committee. You present the business case to steering committee. Steering committee says yay or nay. The capital funding cycle is X number of months or sometimes years, right? What time scale are decisions being made on? How far out is the roadmap planned? How often does it change? Are there a lot of reorgs or shifting around of people or teams? Is this an organization that sort of has this fixed long-term clear strategy, clear roadmap, long capital funding cycles, and then they commit and they do it, which, can also be not good if you're too rigid and inflexible and don't change course? Or is this a sort of chaotic environment where things are changing all the time, people are being reorged all the time, you start a project, it stops, etc.? So just start looking for those clues about how decisions are made and who has power, whether that's sort of explicit or soft power. And yeah, it's really fun what you observe, and sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. I mean, we slightly touched on common mistakes, but are there like some big ones that I don't know you've made or you've seen made that you're just like, oh yeah, I shouldn't do that again. That was a bad call from my side.
Yeah, there's kind of three that I'd call out, and I think we have touched on them in sort of a few different ways, but I'll kind of reiterate. So the big aha for me was, oh my goodness, for so long in my career, I have been confusing participatory design with consensus-based decision-making. So I thought that because we were running these workshops where we would bring in users and bring in, cross sort of functional team members from the organization, and we would run these sessions and we would do co-design and we would get all this input. I thought that meant we had to get to a place where everyone agreed, like consensus-based decision making. And this was just a problem for a couple of reasons. Like, one, it's really hard to get to consensus, and it's unrealistic for a designer to hold all of that. And the other thing is it would set a weird expectation, right? When the decision-making model isn't clear going in, and someone who's come in for this participatory design session thinks they're going to have a say, or thinks that their idea is going to, make it onto the roadmap or get shipped. And then it turns out actually, no, so-and-so is the person with decision rights, and, we're moving in a different direction. That can be really damaging, right? So I think that for me was just this like massive light bulb moment. And it was like, be clear about how decisions are made, and be clear about, are you here for input and consultation? Do you actually have a stake in the decision in this workshop? Or is it really just, we're gathering input and here's how the decision will be made and by whom? So I think that was just huge for me, because I spent a long time thinking that the role of participatory design, co-design, was to drive this consensus-based process, and realizing that actually, like, that doesn't always get to the best outcomes anyway. It can be messy, and it can be designed by committee, which isn't helpful.
Right. Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
that was a huge one. Yeah. And then I think the other one is, and we talked a bit about this, is kind of just the burnout and decision fatigue that comes from treating all decisions as if they're equally important, right? So you're operating in a complex project or organization, you think all decisions are equal, and you're taking on that burden of like really trying to drive towards decisions. And then it's just a recipe for burnout and frustration. And like, we're optimists and perfectionists, and, we see how much better things could be. But I think that, and sort of realizing, like, if it's a reversible decision, that's a great place to hold it more lightly and to really speed up. And if it's an irreversible decision, that's when you should slow down and figure out a really thoughtful way to approach it. There's a story about how Barack Obama only wore, I don't remember what it was, blue or black suits or whatever. But it's like, think about your decision-making capacity as a finite resource, and spend that resource on the things that really matter, that are high stakes and that are not reversible. The other stuff, maybe just like, let it go a little bit more. And then the third one is, I think, what we kind of dove quite deep into around underestimating those environmental, organizational, and cultural factors, right? I think one of the really tough things in a design career is you realize, like, oh, the work of actually designing, it's only a part of it. And it's sometimes the most fun part, and it's the part you want to hone your craft in, and it's the part you love and care about. But there's actually all this other stuff outside of it that we have to get good at to set the conditions to do really great design, right? Navigating the stakeholder and organizational landscape, dealing with team dynamics, figuring out these cultures and decision-making approaches. And you're just like, oh, sometimes you're like, I just want to put my head down and not have to deal with all that and like do really great design, and you're like, oh, that's not the reality though.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If only the world worked like that. That would be awesome.
I know. And I think what's really tough is that it does tank your credibility if you're seen as a designer who's sort of divorced from the realities of organizational, cultural, timing, budget factors, right? If you're just like, yeah, but we should really do this because it's awesome. And it's like, well, that's going to cost, it's going to take us 6 months and it's going to cost $1 million. Like, the reality is we just can't do that. And you don't really want to be seen as someone who is ungrounded or disconnected from those realities, right?
Yeah, that's true. We have a question that came in. Also, someone said, great seeing you, Lynn. Happy 5th anniversary.
Yay!
Yeah, we don't have like whoever, it's just a LinkedIn user, but thanks for jumping in. Okay, we have a question here. How should UX decisions be made when key stakeholders are not easily accessible and tend to micromanage design choices? Oh God.
Oh no.
This happens way too much. Oh God.
I know. Okay. And I'm like, oh, that sounds like a recipe for, I don't know, a stiff drink or whatever you're, whatever you're winding down of choices, because that sounds pretty stressful. I mean, I think there's an inherent, it's almost like an oxymoron. How are they micromanaging if they're not easily accessible? Are they sort of coming in and
Mm.
micromanaging after the fact? Or is it that thing where it's like people are just like, yeah, whatever, you can't get time with them, and then you put something in front of them and they're like, no, actually, this. I mean, this is really tough, particularly if there's power dynamics and hierarchy that you're sort of at the mercy of, in a sense.
Mm.
What I would say though is, what are those clearly defined, boxed in moments in the process where people are invited to give feedback, right? So this is the point in the feedback in the process where you can come and give feedback. So whether that's, setting up a regular kind of crit cadence, on whatever it is, Friday mornings for an hour at 10, we'll present the work and stakeholders can come and give their input and feedback. So creating boxed in moments where feedback is sort of invited, because I think when it's disruptive is when you're like, we're just about to ship this and suddenly someone comes in and is like, no, it should be blue or whatever.
Right.
So trying to be like, here, and then saying to them, like, the moment to give feedback was, X. These things are ready to ship and are off the table. You're welcome to come next Friday morning to look at the next, sprint of work, for example. What else would I say? Any other ideas, Chris, on this?
Yeah, a few. Like it reminds me of when stakeholders kind of like swoop and poop.
Mm-hmm.
So they disappear, but when they come, they just like crap all over your work, and you're like, dude, where were you, right? So exactly the situation I think you mentioned. I also would say don't be afraid to be annoying, and proactive and sort of forward marching, where
Yeah.
if they're not easily accessible and you need something done because it's actually blocking your work, most reasonable people would be like, oh, sorry, I mean, I didn't mean to do that. Let me give you 5-10 minutes of my time or whatever. So it's like, you could probably be more proactive and seek a decision, or at least a sign off of like, oh yeah, you can make that decision if you're not sort of
Mm-hmm.
confident in which way to go. And I found that to be effective, right? Like you could always send multiple emails. You can always
Yeah.
Slack. You can always tap on the shoulder. If, depending on if you're remote or whatever, but don't, and I think also it improves credibility if you do it in a way where you're like, hey, I really want to get your input. Like, I know you're busy, but I just need whatever. Or like, hey, these are the key decisions strategically that we need to make on the design.
Yeah.
I think you're seen more of as a partner than someone in the future, maybe they won't micromanage you just because you've told them why you need a decision from them.
Yeah, I think what's really smart about that too is, like, you're also, if it's email or Slack, you're creating a bit of a paper trail. Hey, there was like 2 or 3 occasions where I put this in front of you, and for whatever reason it was not something you were able to prioritize at the time.
Mm.
The direction we've taken is this because of ABC. And then I think, like you're saying, the sort of micromanaging design choices, like, I would dig into the psychology of, like, why is that happening?
Mm.
Is there a perception, like, what's the perception of the stakes or risk of these decisions? What are they afraid of happening? Why is there not maybe trust in the team? Is there unclear decision rights or governance structure around, like, who actually gets to make those calls? And then when you sort of are saying, hey, here's the decision we've made and the direction we're going, being able to present the sort of rationale for why, the evidence for why, whether that's from, usability testing or your, data and analytics, or maybe, framing. I sort of love this idea of, like, safe to try. So very few
Mm.
decisions are truly irreversible. Of course, we want to be careful when they're, like, really high stakes. But I think if you can shift from a sort of fixed decision to an experiment, oh, hey, we recommend we try this
Mm.
because ABC reasons. We're going to check back in 3 months and see what the metrics are. And if we need to revisit it at that time, we can. So sort of helping to soothe some of the anxieties around, like, this isn't necessarily a permanent, irreversible thing. And particularly helping people to understand the stakes of it, right? Like, is this really high stakes, or actually will it probably be fine, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I was working with the CEO earlier in my career, and he ran a company that helped folks improve their conversion on their website. So what that means is he thought he was an expert in like everything design and user experience. So he would do this to me too, like micromanage the crap out of what I would produce. But to your point, Lynn, it's like, yeah, like if you can show rationale and defend the decisions like logically, like again, it's like best idea wins, right? We're not here to just like clash egos. We're just saying like, oh, this could be better because of XYZ reason. and and you might find yourself, if you can't defend those decisions and you just say yes, that it potentially might not be well thought out enough. If they could just say, hey, have you thought about this thing, and you're like, no, then you need to go back to the drawing board, right?
Mhm.
That could be a you problem sometimes.
Mhm.
So yeah, and a lot of times that happened to me, and I was like, crap, I better be prepared to the next crit, otherwise I'm really just gonna get, shot down, and again lose that credibility because I don't know what
Mhm.
I'm doing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is, not always, and of course you have to assess if this is kind of possible for you and feel safe, but you can actually sometimes say no. The swoop and poop last minute. I actually remember someone doing this for a workshop. This was early in my career. We prepped everything. The boards were, I think the client was coming in like that day or the next day, like, and they came in and they had all these suggestions and feedback. And, there were some things we said, like, yes, we can do that. And there was some things we just said, like, no, sorry, it's too late. Like the print deadline is passed, or, and I think sometimes key stakeholders or senior stakeholders, like, I know I'm guilty of this. It's like, you're
Mm.
trying to be useful. You're trying
Yeah.
to give an opinion. You feel bad that you haven't had time to really engage it. Maybe you miss being in the weeds of the design work.
Mm.
And you want to sort of give all these perspectives. Like, I know sometimes when I'm giving feedback on stuff for the team and it's getting close to a deadline or a deliverable, I have to really filter myself and say, like, don't just dump all your thoughts and ideas, pick the things that are really important. So, experimenting with, like, what happens if you actually just say no to some of it, or like feedback and input. Again, if you have a clear sort of decision rights framework and governance, it's optional. It's an input. I mean, not always, right? If your boss comes in and says, like, you have to do this, but
Right.
just kind of, I think part of your skill as a designer is learning to filter that input, actually.
Yeah.
And say, yeah, that's actually an important thing I hadn't considered, and I'm going to take that back to the drawing board. That cool idea, but we're going to put it into the backlog. We don't have time and budget right now to address it. Thank you. That is all.
Yeah,
Thank you,
exactly.
next, right? Like,
Next. Yeah.
Oh, a good one. I can't remember where I heard this. I think it was actually totally different context, like talking to your parents or something, but that's an interesting idea.
And then just silent. See what happens. Like, yeah.
Oh, thanks. I'll consider it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. There you go. Yeah. Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm being tongue in cheek, right? But
Yeah. Of course. Of course. Yeah. I actually, yeah, I hadn't considered that. Like senior stakeholders, yeah, might just want to be useful, right? Might just want to just
yeah,
like brain dump because they've got like 5 minutes and they're going to another meeting,
yeah,
and they're like,
yeah,
it's not even like super well thought out, but there's just a lot of it. And yeah, that filter that you mentioned, that you're cognizant that you have to filter yourself. I don't think a lot of folks might look at that lens if they're in a busy day, depending on the context of their situation.
yeah.
So it could be that as well, and not necessarily the gospel. So that's a really good
Exactly.
point. That's a really good point.
Exactly. And often, ideally, if you have good trusted relationships, they're actually that's your job. They're trusting you to be
Mhm.
that filter, to have that decision-making skill, and to sort of take their, I think the sort of higher up you go in organizations, the less time you have to be hands-on in the work, to think deeply. You're rushing from meeting to meeting. You're often under a lot of pressures. You're often the shield to the team for these things around investor calls and budget constraints and timeline, and then the next crisis or comms thing to deal with. And so, like, yeah, I think just having a bit of that empathy to say they they're probably trying to do their best to give you all of their thoughts and input, but it's not particularly organized or prioritized sometimes. And it's actually a sign of trust. They're like, oh,
Mm,
Chris will take this and he'll know, implement that, set that aside. So I
yeah.
think it can also be like a good sign. Of course, sometimes it can not, but
We'll give them the benefit of the doubt here, and
yeah.
then and put the onus on us to figure out what's good, or at least like what's right, or what path we should go down versus what's not. We had another question come in. Any examples of decisions that designers may not realize are actually
Ooh.
critical or strategic? Key factors that we may not take
Oh,
seriously enough.
that's such a good question. Design decisions. Strategic. Key factors we may not take seriously enough.
Sometimes I think about questioning the goals of why we want to do what we're doing. So like consumer apps basically optimize for engagement, eyeballs, attention, right? But then uh sometimes B2B apps do this, and you're like, why would you, like, what, like, it doesn't make sense for this feature to just, you just want people to coming back every day and spending longer time. So sometimes it's things like that, and like questioning, like, oh, like, why is this a priority? Okay, if it is a priority, then because we're so used to like certain patterns that are like dark patterns, like the feed, like the endless scroll, sometimes we
Mhm.
don't think that's you're just like, oh, that's a pattern, I could use that. But there's a reason why there's like pagination, not only for performance, but also to be aware that you're not just kind of like taking a user's time. So sometimes like patterns that are just so normal, so consumer
Mm.
based. I think like we don't think too much about it when we're like, okay, we can use the same. And so that would be my thing. Like, notice the patterns you're using, why you're using it, and what is the
Yeah.
goal of that. Yeah, I would say.
I love that, Chris. Like, sort of the idea of, are we just copying what's out there
Mm,
without thinking about our context and our users and what really matters? I think absolutely. Unfortunately, a lot of our digital products are kind of rife with that.
yeah.
I think the other thing that comes to mind, and I was trying to think if I had a more concrete example, but anything that sort of touches like business model, I would say.
Mm,
Um, like I'm thinking a little bit about a project I did a while ago with a legal startup um, that was developing essentially like a DIY or self-serve trademarking tool. This was actually prior to kind of the AI hype that's out there today, but they built this really impressive like machine learning AI model that helped small business owners move through the trademarking process, which is like very complex and esoteric and very interesting.
mm,
Um, but like, I think like I'm not articulating this super well, but essentially what I'm saying is we had a lot of conversations and decisions on that project around who really is your user, and they sort of thought it's everyone, it's all small business owners. And when we dove in and did some of the research, we found there were actually these kind of three personas or profiles. There's the person who is super scrappy and doesn't have money, and that's why they're DIYing. There's the person who actually just wants to
mm,
kind of delegate out the process, and so a self-serve model isn't quite right for them because they sort of want that middle ground of cost effective and a bit more handheld. And I guess what I'm trying to illustrate is like anytime your work starts to touch up against business model, who is our ultimate customer, how are we going to serve them, service delivery model, I think those are times to really pay attention because those types of decisions are really critical and strategic. And so, in that project, I think that the client really thought like, hey, like just design a self-serve DIY like trademarking thing. It's not that complicated. Just make the flow.
yeah.
And we sort of, as you got into it, there were all of these like gating decisions that had to be made because it's actually quite a complex thing.
Mm,
that started to touch on service delivery model. Like, should there be a point at which you could call someone to help you troubleshoot? Like, there's this really high risk point in the flow where it's actually really critical that the words you input for your trademark categories map correctly to the kind of legal framework in the back end. But as a kind of layperson end user, you might be not aware at all. And so like, just some of those things I think start to get really interesting, and trying to kind of bring everyone along and realize how critical and strategic some of these things are, rather than just like, oh, it's just an interface, just, just get them through the flow,
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. Nate really loved those examples. Yeah. And congrats on 5 years again.
Yay,
You were so nice today, huh? Yeah.
I know. I have like the best, most wonderful community of folks. And Chris, it's so nice to come on and get to meet some of your folks and community as well.
Yeah, for sure. I know we're running a little bit on on time. You've probably got a busy day as it's in the morning for you. So I guess just one last question from me, which is I'm not sure if we touched on this, but do you have a go-to framework for making better calls? Like something you teach your team, or like you use with clients? What does that look like?
Yeah, sometimes we'll actually, this is nerdy, but we'll build like custom decision flowcharts and stuff for our clients. Like, we're just like, before you make decision, like go through these steps and gates. But I would say, if I was kind of just to like really try to boil it down, I think it's like, step 1, clarify the decision. What's the decision on the table? What are the options, etc. Name who decides and how. Who has decision rights? What decision-making model are we using? What input is needed? Who has authority? 3, categorize it. So reversible, irreversible, high stakes, low stakes. Can we go fast? Do we need to be rigorous? And then thinking about step 4, just being really thoughtful and intentional about the participation. Do you actually need to do a series of big workshops, or can you just do like an hour crit with your PM, or, etc.? Like, what type of input, what type of participation? And then finally, I think it's that, getting to a decision converging, how can you make it safe to try? So how can you frame it as an experiment, define what success looks like, and say, when are we going to come back and revisit this and see how good of a decision did we make? Like, as an aside, I think that step is fascinating to me. A thing I'm really obsessed with is like, a lot of business casing happens, and I'm like, okay, business casing to go get capital investment, whatever. I'm like, does anyone actually ever go back and say how accurate was our business case? I don't think so. Like, what I've seen, like, no, not very often. And I think business casing is this really fascinating sort of like dark art, right? But what is the closing the loop on the decision? Because the closing the loop on the decision is what's going to help you, your team, your organization get better at decision making. And I have one last little anecdote I can't resist sharing.
Sure.
Worked with this nonprofit. They had this really challenging decision-making structure where the board wanted to be involved in decision-making on every single grant application to the cent of what was going to be dispersed.
Okay.
Very impractical. The organization was growing, the volume of applications was growing, the staff was going bananaramas because they're like, we need to be able to do our jobs. And this was actually my client. I can't take credit for this, but she had this absolutely genius idea where she said, when we present the cases, let's have our staff make a recommendation before the board weighs in and makes the decision. And then let's score how well the staff's recommendation aligns to the board's ultimate decision. So we did this for a few months, and we found that 95% of the time, like that was the actual note, like 90+%, we actually mathematically did this. The staff on the board were like a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5 aligned on the decision. And so what that allowed us to do was to actually quantitatively demonstrate to the board that like you can trust the staff, you're much more aligned than you think. And then it then allowed us to create a new structure where certain grant applications, like there were certain criteria, a certain threshold of funding, and they handed those over to the staff, right? And so the board still retains some decision rights for certain cases which met certain criteria. But I thought this was just absolutely genius. And again, this was my client. This wasn't my idea. Can you make it visible? Can you actually measure alignment? it's just such a cool way to say, like, actually, we're making good decisions, we're closing that loop, and now we can evolve how we make decisions.
It's so cool. Like that, yeah, that is genius and
Genius. My
well
client was
done,
genius.
right? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, all credit to my client, was absolute genius. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But definitely for the folks can get inspired by that idea of like, how do you make it quantifiable? So those decisions that you don't think your boss, manager, or whoever needs to make, that you can kind of take back that based on alignment or credibility or
Yeah.
whatever the thing you want to move is. So yeah, that's really good. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's great too in that is, like, what are those smaller, lower stakes things that you can start to kinda carve out to build that trust and to ladder up, right?
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, exactly. All right, before we let you go, obviously I want to thank you for your time, Lynn, especially in the morning. But tell us what you got going on. I will hide and take as much time as you want,
Oh.
and I'll hide backstage. But tell us what you got going on with everything now, and where can folks find you, what you're working on, all that stuff.
Oh my gosh, amazing. I feel like I'm not super prepared for this.
All
The
good,
first
all
thing
good. Yeah.
Yeah, the first thing is the newsletter. So Ask a Service Designer is our free newsletter. It is my labor of love that I have so much fun writing. It's sort of roughly monthly. It's a kind of long form quality piece. We write about all sorts of different things. How to run really amazing immersive workshops, examples of projects. Last year, I wrote about my kids' pediatric dentist experience and kind of the narrative arc in service design. It's really fun. I'd love to see you there, and it's probably the best way to kind of keep up with what we're doing. So that's the newsletter, Ask a Service Designer. And I welcome you also to reach out and submit a question if there's something you'd like me to write about. The other thing is I'm actually going to run some workshop sessions. We run some kind of online public workshops. And the upcoming one, Tuesday, January 20th, is on this exact topic, decision making in design. So we're going to dive into some of what we talked about today, as well as I'll show you some different frameworks and processes, and you'll have some time to kind of jam with a peer about decisions that you're facing. So if you sign up for the newsletter, I'll be sending that info out, and would love to see some of you there if you want to go deeper into this topic. And then for my local peeps, it is 5 years, and this is sort of TBD, but we are planning a little get together, a little celebration, maybe in spring, summer, and would love to see the community come out. I'll keep you posted as that shapes up. But Chris, I think those are the main things. Maybe the last plug is if you know an organization or a team who would benefit from service design training or capacity building, or has a really exciting, juicy service design project. We always love referrals and meeting great new clients and collaborators. Our business runs on that as a small business. So that would also be mega appreciated. But yeah, Chris, I think that's what I've got.
Awesome. Okay. Well, so annoying that I'm not local because the shindig sounds fun. And so if you guys want to get nerdy about service design then and decision making, scan that QR code, and I'll also drop a link after so you guys can get that. But Lynn, thank you so much for your time. I'll take you off stage and I'll just do final wrap up. But feel free to drop off if you've got something else going on. But again, thank you so much for joining.
Yes, absolutely. And Chris, I realized one resource I promised and didn't mention was if you Google Nobel, Nobl, the Decider, they have a really cool app that helps you look at what decision-making model you should use, like a little sort of quiz. So group decision-making models, how to make better decisions as a team, Nobel. Yeah.
Okay. Nobel the Decider. Okay, I might mess around with that. I think that's really cool. Yeah.
I couldn't figure out an easy way to share the link in the chat, or I don't know if I'm just technologically challenged, but all right, Chris.
Weird. Yeah, LinkedIn is weird. Yeah, like the URL doesn't come up when it's live stream. I don't know. Yeah, product manager just put it out. So thank you.
Yeah. What an amazing start to the year. Thank you, Chris. I will leave you to it.
All right. Thank you very much. See you later. All right, guys. Again, if you want to follow up with Lynn and find out what's going on. The newsletter QR code is there. Feel free to sign up. And again, she has a training on decision making, a free workshop, I think. So all about decision making. Not sure if it's free. Don't hold me to that. But a workshop nonetheless. January 20th, I believe. So go check that out. She'll send you a reminder. And again, before we go, I want to talk about what's next. But a quick reminder of Shift UX, the State of AI Design 2026 report, right? If you're looking for a new role and want to benchmark the most up-to-date design salaries out there, or you're not sure on how to position yourself in 2026 because of AI and it's kind of eating the whole world, or you want to transition from a generalist designer to more of this architect type, check out this report and live briefing. Again, QR code scan both of these sides. And if you use my code Chris100, you'll get 100% off. So you download, read the report, 17-page PDF. And if you still got questions, please join that briefing where Rajiv can go through all your questions, right? Again, Chris100 for 100% off. And the next thing we have going on is on the 21st of January. So not next week, but the week after. And we're calling this How Junior Designers Are Fucked. How fucked are junior designers, or how junior designers fucked? Both names, basically, I'll be speaking to Florian, a staff product designer, about the realities of being a junior designer in 2026, what that means, like how to navigate this, maybe some common mistakes. We'll talk about ones we made personally, but also what we see in the industry today. And then also how to succeed in this current market and so much more. So if you're early in your career or just kind of thinking about like, am I making the same mistakes as a mid-level or a senior, or what learnings can I get from Chris and Florian, then please join that conversation. You can get notified live.uxplaybook.org or scan that QR code, and I'll, join that newsletter so I could ping you when that happens. And something we are doing new with the newsletter for the folks and the live stream is that, these conversations are amazing, but I think I did a disservice where either you watched the 1 hour long live stream, right, or you caught a bit of it, but there wasn't really another way for you to sort of consume and extract the learnings from the guests I have on. So what I'm doing is I've combined my newsletter and live stream sort of places to notify people into one. And the session that we have today with Linn, I'll be sending the takeaways and learnings next Monday. So every week you would get either an invite on Monday to the next live stream on Wednesday, or you'll get the learnings from the previous week. So, they're going to be relatively short emails. You can read it in 2 minutes, but it'll extract the key takeaways and actionable steps. Like, for example, we spoke about, the steps that Linn used for her decision making, right? So things like that. So if that sounds great, instead of watching the whole thing, well, we'll love to have you, but if you're just too busy, you can just read the super, super short email. So again, live.uxplaybook.org, sign up and you'll get the lessons and insights and, tidbits and anecdotes that we share in the live stream, but in written format. Some people just prefer that, right? But this was the first stream of 2026. So thank you for joining, and I will see you Jan 21st. So until next time, bye. This is the design of everyday people.
It sound This is the design of everyday people.